A warm welcome to all of you joining us for this seminar, the Posthumanities Hub seminar and the Eco and Bioart Lab seminar. And today we are all gathering from all corners of the world under the heading of toxic/trans/slash bodies. And we are so very happy to welcome our speakers here today. Dr. Wibke Straube from Karlstad University and Andria Nyberg Forshage, hailing from Stockholm in Sweden. So the idea for today is to talk about, of course, toxic and trans and bodies in all these kind of constellations. And I say once again, as I admit people to the room, a warm welcome. Yes. And today we are going to talk about toxic embodiment and trans issues. And we all know that toxins, of course, have become a widespread and well-known threat to life on the planet. In fact, with all kinds of chemical exposures, accumulating in bodies, human and non-human bodies of all kinds. We have endocrine disruptors, neurotoxins, asthmagens, carcinogens, and all kinds of mutagens that are accumulating in our bodies. And it is, but toxins also have made it into our social imaginary, into art, and toxicities are being discussed in so many different ways within feminist and queer post-humanities, environmental humanities. And these fields of research have long problematized what gets to count as the natural body, what gets to count as the human body, of course. And today we are so happy to have two of the most prominent commentators on this in the field. Wibke Straube and Andria Nyberg Forshage will be introduced very shortly to all of you. But I can mention that Wibke Straube has also an article in the Duke University Press journal, Environmental Humanities, where they are presenting previous research on this. But without further ado, I would like to say again a warm welcome to everybody. And my name is Cecilia Åsberg, and I'm a professor at Linköping University. And I have the great honor to, together with Lina Ram, a Ragnar Holm postdoc at KTH, and also to be assistant professor now for 6 years at KTH in the Division of Historical Studies of Science, Technology and Environment. We are so happy about that. So the two of us, Lina and me, will be your hosts for this seminar today. So perhaps, Lina, I can ask you to introduce our speakers.
Yes, thank you, Cecilia. And thank you so much, Wibke and Andrea. We look so much forward to your presentation. But first, let me tell you a little bit of the structure for today. So today, this seminar will start with presentation by Wibke. After that, we will have a short Q&A of just like 5 minutes. And after that, we're excited to listen to Andrea's presentation. And after that, a short Q&A, just to give a chance for you all, if you have some quick follow-up questions, if you want them to say something more about something or clarify something. After Andrea's exciting presentation, we will have a short break of 10 minutes. And after the break, when we come back, we will open the floor for questions, discussions, and anything you want to talk about. So I'm very proud to welcome Dr. Wibke Straube, who will be the first presenter today.
Thank you so much.
So,
thank you, Lena, for the introduction, and thank you all from the Posthumanities Hub and the BioLab for inviting me. It's so lovely that this event is finally taking place. It was supposed to happen last year already, but we had to cancel it due to the pandemic and us needing to learn how to handle this new situation first. So now it's happening and it's lovely. Let me share my screen with you so I can show you.
When you're sharing your screen, can I just very quick tell people a little bit more about you? Is that okay? So I just wanted to say that Wibke Straube is a senior lecturer at the Center for Gender Studies at Karlstad University. Their work focuses on the intersectional analysis of trans, non-binary, and queer embodiment, effective methodologies, and affinities of different socially marginalized bodies, their forms of survival and possibilities to create zones of liability. So,
thank you so much.
The floor is yours.
Thank you. I totally forgot about that part of the introduction. Good, you just jumped in. So yes, this is the topic of my talk, chemicals, endocrine disruptors, and unruly bodies in trans and queer art, or particularly Nordic trans and queer art. This is a paper that is really work in progress, I have to say. I have not developed it much further. It's something that I've been planning to work on for a while now, but due to a few other papers that I had sort of to finish first and not having research funding, I didn't have the time to really work on it. But what happened is that I just recently got a really nice grant to finally work within the area of trans ecologies. And so this project that I'm presenting on today, or this paper, is part of this project. It's called Trans-Creative Health, Violence, and Environment in Transgender Cultural Production. And this is our project funded by the Kone Foundation in Helsinki until 2024. And we are a team of 3 researchers and 2 artists working together. So just for you to know more about the context of this paper. My previous research and this research that will happen within this project is happening in the field of trans ecologies, we could call it, or addressing trans bodies in the context of questions of nature. These are 3 articles that I have published in this context, and the 2019 one is the one that Sissy also just mentioned in the special issue on toxicity and environmental humanities. Yes, let's say. This is a quote that is guiding me throughout my journey in this topic. It's a quote from the poet Oliver Bandorf. I'll read it out to you. Nature matters for trans studies and trans bodies because of how we map and are mapped along boundaries of inside and out, natural and unnatural. So this is really sort of something that appears again and again in my writing and my thinking, the importance of addressing the question of what is nature, what is the natural and unnatural when we think about trans and queer bodies, especially if we contextualize this with the history of the 20th century, where the trans and queer body has been stigmatized as unwell and like ill, basically, and also often as unnatural. So this is why it is so significant to really address these questions of nature and naturality and unnatural from the perspective of trans studies. I situate my research in general in the field of trans studies. I've been working in that field for the past 20 years. I position myself as a non-binary researcher, and I don't identify as trans myself. And apart from trans studies, my work is also embedded in feminist posthumanities, as well as environmental humanities, touching upon these areas. So the questions that are guiding my presentation today are 2, and they go into 2 different directions, but they are interconnected. To move here the camera images so I can read it. First one is, how does the trans body emerge in medical, epidemiological, and environmental research on endocrine disruptors? This question is important because there's a lot of conversations about the effect of EDCs on bodies and how they are formed in a gender non-conforming way. I'll say more about this shortly. The other question is, how is plastic pollution and chemical pollutants taken up in trans and queer art? What trans body emerges here, and what new imaginaries and trans ecological scenarios exist in art? This is, maybe we could even say, the central element of my paper, but it's kind of divided half and half in a way in terms of time of my presentation, I'd say. And maybe in addition to all of this, I have to say I'm speaking to you completely freely without a manuscript, because I lost my manuscript last night when my laptop crashed, and I could retrieve some parts of the PowerPoint, but my text is gone. So I'm just gonna see what I can gather here and just speak freely. Yes, my material today. What I'm planning is to walk through different materials with you and look at how exactly the trans bodies and EDCs are put into connection with each other. One is a Facebook post that went viral. Another one is a neurological study by Uppsala University that is given out to people in the evaluation process in the trans clinics. Another one are quotes from different medical articles addressing EDCs and trans bodies. And as a last item, we're looking at 3 different artworks. So I need a short sip of water. So this is the Facebook post. I will read it to you, but short trigger warning, it's really pretty harsh. So I'll read it out to you. When people understand that sexual development problems are caused by synthetic chemical pollutants, then they can accept how teaching gender in schools is promoting the most backwards and corrupt system possible. The promotion of gay and trans is the promotion of sexual development disorders caused by environmental pollutants and media and educational manipulation. The promotion of homosexuality and gender at children tries to promote the view that transgender and homosexuality are natural and healthy lifestyle choices, which is not true. So yes, I can say you probably are also quite shocked if you're not familiar with this. I was really shocked and triggered by reading this when the journalist here that I'm quoting this from wrote about it, Maria Chorando. The Facebook post was, of course, erased really quickly after this, and the vegan group in which this was posted distanced themselves from this and really declared that this was an individual's opinion, even though the question is this actually really just one individual's opinion? But that's another conversation maybe. So here we see really the correlation between the understanding of trans bodies as being polluted, as being sort of, affected by environmental pollution, but not only affected, but they're actually created by it. And this is an interesting phenomenon because we know historically that the trans body has been seen as a body that has been mentally ill or classified as mentally ill through the diagnostic process. It is classified in manuals for mental disorders, and is only now in the recent years shifted partly, but still trans requires a diagnosis that is connected to mental health. So what is happening here is maybe that there's a shifted understanding visible that moves the body from a mental pathology into a body that is an environmental pathology. And that is quite interesting, I think. So while we are in the process of depathologizing the trans body, we're seeing a repathologization here in popular discourses through environmental illness. So transgender is here conceptualized as an environmental illness, basically, rather than something that is just an existent normality or yeah, so here we dive right into the question of what is natural and what is not. Apparently, within this discourse, trans is not considered as a natural form of existing or a normal way of existing, but it is a deviation. So what are actually these chemical pollutants that I'm talking about, and EDCs? EDCs, or endocrine disrupting chemicals, are substances in the environment. They come up in air or in soil or in drinking water, for instance. They're human-made, or they are also naturally occurring partly. They interfere and mimic within the body endocrine system. They mimic estrogen, androgens, and thyroid hormones. Among others, they are these substances called DDT, PVC, PCB, TCE, so many others that I'm listing here, bisphenol A as one of them, phthalates, difficult word to pronounce, phthalates, yes. So these substances really have these endocrine disrupting effects. Trying to move the camera so I can, the images. So they appear in products. That's a really wide palette of products where they appear: herbicides, fungicides, pesticides, cosmetics, detergents, household plastics, all kinds of soft plastic, dental seals, and many more. So we as humans, animal bodies, all of this world is in constant interaction and correlation with these items, and we are all affected by them. Yes, so they have damaging health effects, no doubt. They produce cancer, neurological illnesses, organ failure. There are also suspicions of it affecting neurodiversity, autism spectrum. And now, as we just saw, or as this is part of this conversation here now, is they're also discussed as shaping gender dysphoria or gender identity questions. And this is quite phenomenal, I think, because of course we are really familiar with these discourses in terms of like the fears that in society exist regarding phthalates and the EDCs, of like feminization or masculinization, things that are really exceeding the boundaries of the gender norms, intersex fish, intersex human beings. All of these things are discussed within the context of EDCs. So the effect on them on the bodily scale is really familiar, and different queer and trans scholars have already discussed that we should move the focus of the fear of EDCs towards where we actually should be afraid of, like, or where we should be actually fearful of, which is cancer and the actual health risks that we get from EDCs, rather than focusing on the feminization or masculinization that these hormone disruptors can evoke. So the fear about gender norms should be put into the background, has been argued. And of course, this is vital and important because from a queer and a trans perspective, we would say there's nothing wrong with more gender diversity. This is just an enrichment. And it is also, it is. But what is really new here is really the conversation about EDCs and the interaction with gender dysphoria. This is how it is discussed in the text: gender dysphoria, not so much gender or trans identity, but this is basically what it is also. Yes, before I move further into this conversation and take you to the next item, a short conversation on definitional terms here. I'm not so sure everyone here has a background or knows a lot about trans studies or trans as a definition in itself. And trans can be an umbrella term, but it can also be a very specific location of identity. As an umbrella term, it includes all kinds of gender variant, gender non-conforming positions. And as a very specific identity term, there's like a trans identity. In my application, I use trans as a more sort of processual, wider term. I follow here Finn Enke saying that trans is in a way from birth assigned sex. And I'm following also Susan Stryker, also a trans scholar, saying trans is a movement across a socially imposed boundary away from an unchosen starting place. So both of these quotes are quite within the sphere of gender identity or gender location. And then the next two ones are taking us even further. And these are sort of also the kind of like emerging ways of thinking trans right now. Also by two trans scholars, Eva Hayward and our Linköping colleague, Jamie Weinstein. Trans is not a thing or a being. It is rather the process through which thingness and beingness are constituted. In its prefixal state, trans is prepositionally oriented, marking the with, through, of, in, and across that makes life possible. Trans troubles ontologized states. And also the next quote by Myra Hurd, trans as a broader sense of movement across, through, and perhaps beyond traditional classifications. So here you see also a transitionary movements, maybe in the quotes even, from a more narrow definition of trans as like an away from birth assigned sex, but having something to do with gender, into more of like a processual force that is what makes life possible. So this is that. Next item, I'm taking you now into the neurological conversation happening at Uppsala University. This is a study that is given out as a survey to people in the trans clinics in the evaluation process. It started in 2016. So far, 300 and more respondents have responded to the survey. And so this survey is offered, as I'm writing here on the right side, it is offered to patients or trans people in the evaluation process. The evaluation process is a process that takes up to 2 years. You regularly meet a team of different social workers, different doctors, endocrinologists, all kinds of psychiatrists, psychologists, and so on that evaluate you if you are really trans, and eventually you get also medical transitionary medical support if you want that. And whatever happens in this evaluation process is, of course, not the question of like consent is here a bit wishy-washy, one could say. This is why I wrote offered in quotation marks, because patients in these processes are most likely to oblige to what is offered to them rather than to say no, because you are so vulnerable in the situation of really wanting something from the medical team and hoping you get hormone treatment or surgeries or whatever diagnosis you're also looking for. So there's a power relation and a gatekeeping system in place in which this is not easy to say that this survey is simply something people volunteer to do in this survey. Now I'm coming to the actually interesting part of this. People are being asked about their exposure to chemicals. And this is done through tests, saliva and blood test, PUK test, which I'm not so sure what that actually is, and milk teeth analysis. And the question here is in English, and it's a quote from the website, to find possible connections between gender dysphoria and exposure to different pollutants in vitro and in early childhood. And I find this also really interesting because for me, from my perspective, in which I'm looking at trans and non-binary existence, of course, it seems almost, it seems sort of surprising to make that connection with chemical pollutants. And having spoken to some epidemiologists, whatever, there is actually like the people that are not necessarily informed about trans conversations have like quite naively said sometimes, yeah, there is this rapid increase of people seeking support or evaluation in the trans clinics in the last years. So where does that come from? Maybe it is chemical pollutants. I'm like, yeah. That's an interesting hypothesis. I'm not so sure if that's really gonna turn out as you think it will, but let's see. So I'm very curious, really curious about the results of this study. I have contacted the PI of the study, but haven't heard back from them yet, unfortunately, because I think the results will be published soon. So yes, this is another conversation. Apart from the popular blog post that I just showed you from Facebook, this is sort of the neurological interrogation of this conversation between trans bodies and EDCs. And yes, let's see if I can take you. Yeah, this is from the patient information leaflet. English translation here, also mine. Using modern methods of analysis, we will, for example, investigate whether a person has been exposed to environmental substances that can affect the risk of developing gender dysphoria. So, yeah. Yes. So these were the first two items. Now we're coming to the third one, where I would like to give you a few quotes from different medical articles taking up this topic as well. And then we'll move on to our work. I'm reading those three quotes to you. There seems to be a growing concern with regards to the relationship between endocrine disruptors and transsexuals, as well as other gender minority populations. That's the first quote. Second quote, endocrine disruptors, the increase of autism spectrum disorder and its comorbidity with gender identity disorder, a hypothetical association. I think that was the title of this text. And the third quote, scientists today are asking hard questions about potential human effects. Can EDC exposures even be involved in the etiology of children born with ambiguous genders? So yes, this is different ways of taking up this conversation, partly in relation to gender dysphoria, or the old school term or medical term transsexuality is used here. And then the last quote discusses more the physical side, genital formation, which is something we might find less surprising in this context because of longer conversations already and research on EDCs, on bodies and reproductive system and genitals and animals and humans. So how am I doing with time, Lena? Could you just tell me, have I been speaking for 20 minutes or longer?
No, 20 minutes. You have a lot of time left, so okay. Go ahead. I will stop you when you reach 30 minutes, if that's okay with you.
Yes, absolutely. Good. It just felt like I've been speaking for a long time.
We're all here and we're listening.
Good. So you're all with me still, yeah?
For sure.
All right.
Super exciting.
Okay. So good. Yes. So what we see here really in those three sort of scientific discourses, medical, neurological, is what I said earlier as well, is this shift from seeing trans as a mental illness towards seeing trans as connected to environmental illness. And here I have a couple of pictures from the two manuals that are used in the US and in the European context. DSM is used in the US more, and the ICD is used in Europe for diagnosing people with gender incongruence in the ICD, which is the diagnosis every trans and non-binary person needs in order to get access to gender confirmation treatments. And even though this is, of course, in the process of being depathologized, the fact that it's still in a manual that is called Mental and Behavioral Disorders is in itself, of course, provocative and problematic, and is at the same time, of course, also necessary to have some form of diagnosis in some sense in order to have medical access and medical support, but in which way this necessarily needs to be in a medical class, in a mental classification system. So of course, a question, and it's a large discussion. But there are attempts of depathologizing trans in different ways, or gender dysphoria, gender incongruence. Gender dysphoria is the term used in the DSM, and gender incongruence is the term used for the ICD. So I'm saying this only because I witness here, or I would say this is what we can observe in these conversations on EDCs, is that while we in society have a depathologization of being trans or being non-binary, we at the same time move trans into another form of pathology, and that is one that is now possibly environmental. Yeah. this is actually a quote that I just put here because it is from a beautiful text that is also sort of guiding my work in many ways in this field by Malin Arking, a Swedish biologist, and Eva Hayward, trans philosopher, who both have written this text together, addressing sex as a responsive potential in the context of chemical pollution. And yes, it's just a really worthwhile read. But it doesn't really, address exactly what I'm trying to get at with this paper, since they are still talking about sex as responsive in the context of environmental pollution and the entanglement of human, more than human, and natural world. And I'm looking at the sort of effect of sort of the more, like almost like the sensory level of being trans, the dysphoria, as it is discussed in the medical conversations. But I mean, from a trans non-binary perspective, it doesn't necessarily need to be dysphoria. Being trans or being non-binary is a self-perception and an identity in itself, not necessarily connected to dysphoria. And seeing that in the position or constellation with EDCs is what I'm trying to talk about and investigate in this material, is how that is actually taken up. Yes. Is there anything else that I wanted to say and to conclude this part before I move on? I have like handwritten notes here on my side. No, I'm moving on now. And now we're coming to sort of the artistic work that I have been I'm still in the process of looking for artistic work that takes up this topic, because what we know from art is that art is sort of a field in which people respond to societal questions or take up societal questions or make their own conversations. But there is a response relationship between what is going on in society and art, and different ways of communicating that with each other, of course. And I'm interested in what happens in art with this topic. How are these conversations that are now thriving on EDCs and trans people and the increase in trans population taken up in art? Before I want to talk about Camille's work here, what I haven't said earlier is that when I just spoke about people being sort of surprised about the increase of people approaching the clinics for getting a diagnosis to get access to medical treatments, there is, of course, from a trans perspective, no doubt why that increase actually happens, and that is in no way, from our perspective, I would say, connected to environmental factors, but to societal and political factors, such as an increase in anti-discrimination laws, an increase in visibility and knowledge in society about what trans is and what non-binary is, and just simply a larger sort of inclusion and less discrimination and a minimization, or like a decrease in sort of, no, I cannot say a decrease in violence, because that has unfortunately not decreased, but there's an increase in visibility and knowledge in society. And that is, I would say, of course, this is the reason why we have more and more non-binary and trans people in society today, because people can actually come out, people can actually become aware of who they really are. And that has nothing to do with EDCs. But that is, there seems to be different opinions on that and different approaches towards investigating that. So now I'm curious about how is art taking up this topic? How is sort of the trans body reimagined in art in the context of pollution, and sort of what trans ecological imaginaries are possibly brought to us from the artistic world? So the first artist that I would like to present to you is called Camille Auer. Camille works in Turku in Finland and identifies on her website as trans gay luxury anarchist, artist and writer who loves dogs, licorice, ice cream, philosophical apps and quantum physics. I use the pronoun she, because that is what I have taken from her website. And I have unfortunately not had the possibility to have a conversation with Camille yet about her work. But what it says here, I read this to you on the tarpaulin. I am Trash Island. Don't even think about messing with my legacy. I will eat you all. I will suffocate and suck the life out of you. I am made of plastic. I was not made, I was born, really. I was born in the streams of ocean, my ancient black blood flowing from the crevices of earth, taking on all the colors of consumer capitalism. I am all your desires, I am all your fears. I spread my spores and breed tiny children. The future is mine. So I think this is an interesting work in the context of chemical pollution and plastic pollution. Reading this in a simple way as trans work is not possible, but I find that, like, in the sense of like through transgender particular lens, but there is something very specific about it that I'm intrigued by. I think there is, like, the narrator, first of all, is the plastic itself that is talking to us. There's a voice that is usually not something we hear. There's a problematic anthropomorphization of a tarpaulin, but there's also something in the voice that I find interesting, because the more than human world is not something we ever listen to or consider much as humans. And the voice is something we might pay attention to. There's evil, this voice is a very evil and angry and revengeful one. And maybe this tarpaulin, which is PVC material, it is purely made out of plastic that leaks, that emits its disrupting, hormone disrupting molecules into the water and into the soil, is maybe a trans body in itself. Of course, not in the narrow sense of transgender, but in the prefixal state of trans as a transitionary life force. Maybe in this context, not necessarily life, but also death. And this is a future that is mine, is a doomed future, is the one that we are all fearing, the apocalyptic future, the non-survivability of our planet. So there is sort of a trans imaginary that is unfolded here that I find really important and interesting, because it really takes us out of this, we can make everything better, we're just gonna, have to clean up the planet. And it takes us into like a really angry scape of like, no. And there's something, that I'm not able to like narrate this for you right now verbally, because I have to write about this first, and then I can make probably, or maybe not, but hopefully make more meaning out of it. And I'm also really looking forward to the conversation with you, because maybe someone of you has also a nice idea of how to write about this, because I'm looking for concepts. I'm coming to another artwork here that is Calder Haben. Calder is a Canadian artist living in Copenhagen. And this is from their website. Their pronoun is they, according to their bio on the website. It seems to be photographic work. Also waiting for contacting them and interviewing them as soon as I start my research in the end of this year. And this photographic work of these sunglasses, so for those of you who are not looking at the screen for whatever reasons, so what we are seeing here is photography of sunglasses that must have been immersed in the ocean for a very long time, so that seashells have started to grow on it and have transformed a piece of plastic into a coral reef-like habitat. And also here we see a transitionary state of an object becoming something completely different, becoming a wearable, humanly useful object into something that's very useful and livable for animals. And I think that the concept of appropriation or reappropriation is really nice to think this work with, because nature has claimed it back. Despite of it leaking toxins, it is becoming a habitat, and the concept of reappropriation is such an important concept when it comes to queer politics and trans politics. Just if you think about the word queer in itself being one big appropriation of a derogatory slur. Being trans, being non-binary is basically the work, also being queer. It's the work of daily reappropriating your body and your existence as like a normal human being that is not weird, that is not something else, that is not other, and that is not unnatural, as it's something that we have often heard. And we often keep hearing about trans and queer bodies, also as the Facebook post just proven this to us. So this is a discourse that I think is interesting to read this artwork with, a reappropriation. And yeah, yes. So I come now to the last artwork, and then I will also stop talking. I'm not so sure actually if the artist is maybe even present here in our group today. We have never met. The artist is called Andria Alarona, Helsinki-based artist. And I found this work through friends of mine working in Finland, part of my collaborators in the Kone-funded project as well, who made me aware of the work of this artist. I don't know if they go by the name Anna or Theo. I think I'm just gonna say the artist and use they, because I think that's their pronouns. And in this work, it's a performance. It's called Toxino-Sexo-Future Comings. A lot of sort of narration about the queer and trans body in the context of hormones happens. But the hormones here is not so much necessarily the chemical endocrine disrupting hormones, but ingested hormones, purposefully ingested hormones, and then the problematization of it. I will read part of the description of this performance from their homepage to you. Toxino-Sexo-Future Comings is a body fiction about pleasurable sex on a polluted planet, the speech performance of a body making itself with words. And the performance, sex is seen as an evolutionary and developmental process. It opens up a world in which materials and multi-species bodies infiltrate each other, giving and receiving pleasure. The world is thoroughly polluted, but possible, queer and trans. Toxino-Future Comings is a performance about an anticipatory and transformational state. And here, a quote from, I think, part of the performance I quoted. Ages ago, about exactly 1 week after having Nexplanon removed from the inner side of my left arm under the skin, I felt how my shoulders widened. Nexplanon is a birth control implant that releases progestin. It contains 68 milligrams of the active substance estrogestrel. Synthetic progestin mimics the actions of progesterone, a naturally occurring hormone. So yes, this is, I think, really interesting because this discusses hormones in the context of queer and trans bodies, not in the way, basically I just said what I'm about to say now, but yes, in the purposefully ingested way, and how that affects the body, and how stop taking it and like refusing to take it also affects the body in a way that does something very interesting with it. It's a remasculinization that is welcomed, and the widening of the shoulders, or yeah. And I'm not so sure how to sort of make sense of this yet. And I'm sorry, I'm presenting such unfinished work here to you. It's really, I'm in the middle of the thinking process of this. And I will investigate this further. There's something I find intriguing about the entanglement of pollution here, the intentional taking of hormones, which is something that a lot of trans people share anyway, in terms of estrogen or testosterone. And yeah, so this is something I find important and interesting to look at. Yes. Why I have picked 3 artists that are Nordic based is something I'm not so sure if I will stick to that frame for my paper, but I might, because I think particularly looking at trans artists in the Nordic context is relevant in relation to something that I haven't even like said so far, but there is sort of an idea of purity, of whiteness, of certain norms that are related to race and ethnicity in the Nordics that have a lot of relationship to questions of purity, but also pollutedness, and that they relate also a lot to trans bodies and queer bodies. And this is very important to investigate this in relation to each other intersectionally. So this is something I will do when I develop this paper further. And this is work, just briefly showing you, I'm not reading this. These are just a few references that are guiding my thoughts on endocrine disruptors and trans. Yes, if you have any comments, please just email me. My email is here. And I'm ending my presentation here, I think. Yes. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening.
Thank you so much, Wibke.
Yeah.
Incredible. I'm looking so much forward to following your project writings and thoughts in the future. So we will open up for just quick comments, asking for clarification. It's now like 5 minutes, so you could just raise your hand or post questions in the chat. Well, this is really a friendly environment, so you could just speak up also. There will also be questions, time for questions later on. So you can think about everything you want to discuss with Wibke for a while, and you can post them in the chat when you think of them. We'll save them for later if you like. So we're moving on.
Can I just, Lina, ask something to Wibke that maybe we can actually discuss it later on, but just so to give Wibke some time to to ponder it. And I was thinking about when you discussed the work of Camille Hours, and you I think you said something, but maybe it's me being slow here, but you said something about a problematic anthropomorphism of that trash island. I'm thinking, could it be also possibly a strategic anthropomorphism of the trash island character of the art piece? So maybe we can talk about strategic anthropomorphism. I mean, think about Kafka. And I mean, there's so much to think about that. So, I mean, this is just something I want to hear you talk more about this later on. Thank you so much, Wibke.
Great comment or question.
Looking forward to discussing this a bit later. So we're excited to know also more about Andria's work. So Andria Nyberg is a writer, theorist, and poet, and part of the editorial team for the Palette and Art Journal. She has previously presented research at conferences, including the first International Trans Studies Conference at the University of Arizona and the first International Queer Death Studies Conference at Karlstad University. So, Andria, I will now hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Lina, and thank you, Cecilia and Wibke and the Posthumanities Hub and the Echo and Bioart Lab. It's a great honor to be here. So my paper is titled T for T for T for T for T, Fourfold Sex and Trans-Individuation at the End of the World. And briefly, I could say that this is a paper that I originally drafted ahead of the pandemic, and I have slightly revised it and updated it to allow for some lessons from the past year. But it is also a thinking process, and is a part of, I would say, an ongoing project of mine, a critical literary and artistic or curatorial investigation into trans aesthetics and philosophy, touching on issues of biopower, necropower, queer depth, sovereignty, subjectivity, where trans is not the object of inquiry, but rather a form of life from which and with which the analysis departs. So, Tori Peters' 2016 novella Infect Your Friends and Loved Ones begins and ends with the image of a pig's head, glassy-eyed and wax-like, with the letters T for T seared into its skin. As a character in the novel explains it, T for T is an ideal of solidarity, community, and/or love between trans women. She says, quote, "All it took was the end of the world to make that happen," end quote. Why is this? The character, a trans girl named Lexi, is herself tattooed with the letters T for T, just like the pig served up on the front and back cover images of the book. Pigs appear throughout the narrative, which opens with the narrator, another trans girl, going to feed the sows. She despises them, owing less to their differences and more to their similarities and the asymmetrical becomings together in which they are engaged. The novella depicts a North American society, quote, after contagion, end quote, where all human bodies have ceased to be able to rely on their endogenous endocrine systems following an act of transgender bioterrorism. Instead, they require exogenous treatments to maintain hormonal balances, testosterone and/or estrogen, at pre-contagion levels. This contagion is achieved through the homebrew re-engineering of a commercial vaccine for industrial use, intended to inhibit testosterone production in boars for the production of enhancing the flavor of their meat. The vaccine is said to work by triggering an autoimmune response to the gonadotropin, quote, resulting in a complete cessation of the production of all sex hormones, end quote. Together with another trans girl, Raline, Lexi conceives of a plot to make it contagious by bonding it not with, quote, an inert protein, end quote, but rather with live bacteria, strep pneumonia, which is then released into the world through the narrator, which we'll come back to. As such, in the novella, the explicit cyborg condition of using pharmaceutically produced sex hormones, which would otherwise mark certain subjects and not others as trans, within a gendered imaginary relying on the fiction of natural bodies and sexes, becomes generalized as an apocalyptic and manifestly violent event as the society descends into civil war following the large-scale disruption of human hormonal sex and reproduction. Ironically, it is the sows, quote, ugly mutant pigs, end quote, and freaky creatures who come to ensure a supply of hormonal products, having been, quote, genetically modified to overproduce bioidentical hormones to humans. In this aspect, the novella's science fiction scenario, dealing with the biochemical, the animal, the hormonal, the viral, and what Akil Mbembe in the context of contemporary necropolitical modes of coloniality calls the techno-molecular, represents a mutation of the present. As Eva Hayward notes of the entwining of animal and trans becomings, the development of hormonal regimes in modern medicine has been one of what she terms tranimalities, from at least one of its ambiguous beginnings, the extraction of progesterone and estrogen from the urine of pregnant mares, marketed under the pharmaceutical name Premarin since 1941. Hayward writes, quote, trans itself is a species technology and is always involved with non-humans, end quote. Infect Your Friends and Loved Ones replaces horses with pigs, and the marked categories of hormonal tranimalities expands to engulf humanity itself through the pandemic, and an extension of the affects and problematics often ascribed to hormonal makeup and new modes of naturalization of regimes of sex during the past century in response to their destabilization. As Paul Preciado observes of the post-World War II era, quote, the invention of the biochemical notion of the hormone and the pharmaceutical development of synthetic molecules for commercial uses radically modified traditional definitions of normal and pathological sexual identities, end quote. In particular, I would argue, these modified constructions of the normal and the pathological rely on a schema of vital necessity and moderation, which is constantly threatened by both lack and excess, permeating all of biopower, as much in terms of population management and production as in effective and emotional management, such as when the narrator remarks that, quote, industrial grade hormones in my body make me a crazy bitch, end quote. In the novella, the state of necessary instability is taken to the society-wide extreme. Here, I want to note that, as has been made clear during the past year, terrorism, genetic modification, vaccines, civil war, autoimmunity, and sexually deviant forms of so-called recruitment are all ever more common tropes within political discourse, as well as in what the collective Wu Ming has termed conspiracy fantasies. Though published a few years before the currently ongoing coronavirus pandemic, Infect Your Friends and Loved Ones points to the persistence of these themes, to what might be termed the diagram of power and subjectivation in our present era. It would indeed be a misnomer to call it a work of pre-pandemic speculative fiction, as shown by the still ongoing HIV/AIDS pandemic and multiple other pandemics and epidemics only during the course of the 20th and 21st centuries. In the novella, contagious endocrine disruption plunges society into what is only in passing referred to as the Rift Wars, in which the United States devolved into a state of civil war between the government, state militias, and other groupings. How this happens is not clear, although it corresponds to a similar fracturing and shift in terms of gendered sexed identities and embodiments, where cis hegemony can no longer be upheld with reference to a supposed natural state for a figuring of endogenous biochemistry. Questions of hierarchy for ownership and access to means of hormonal reproduction become contested, or rather, the violence inherent in such hierarchy becomes visible, all the more visible. Estrogen is reserved by the authorities for, quote, fertile women, end quote, who can bear children. And while the racial politics of this go mostly uncommented on, it points, in the novella, it points to how reproductive futurism, and by extension, the reproduction of existing power structures, is prioritized over the flourishing of living beings in any state of crisis management. Meanwhile, testosterone becomes an object of conspicuous consumption for so-called T-slabs of any gender, while trans women who face increasing persecution come to blend in among those, quote, auntie boys, end quote, who had to settle for estrogen. In this way, through catastrophic hormonal drift, the novella provides a sketch for the interrelations of human and non-human entangled autoimmunity within the body's systems, of gender and sex as societal regulation, and of law, military and state or non-state violence in the constitution of society. While much work has been done in recent years, and in particular, perhaps during the last year, on the way that what might be called an immuno-security paradigm intersects with nationalist state politics and bio/necro power. Already in Donna Haraway's seminal essay, The Promises of Monsters, from 1991, there is a succinct summary of the reconfigurations of bodies, human bodies, political bodies, affected by the molecularization of biopolitics. Haraway departs from a 1980s context where, partly in response to HIV/AIDS, popular scientific accounts of immune systems and autoimmunity become not only increasingly common, but also increasingly militarized. The foremost model for this case is the Reagan-era Star Wars initiative, combining high-resolution imaging techniques on an orbital and planetary scale with miniaturization and the similar use of new visual technologies for figuring the body on a cellular scale. Mapping this shift in the view of the self, the body, and its borders onto 4 dimensions or 4 quadrants on a semiotic square, Haraway proposes to draw up the connections between, quote, A, real space or Earth, B, outer space or the extraterrestrial, not B, inner space of the body, and finally, not A, virtual space, or the science fiction world oblique to the domains of the imaginary, symbolic, and the real, end quote. crucial to each of these is the notion of invasion and of a space to be defended, a notion which would serve to ground a mode of subjectivity, but which is, however, complicated by the untenability of any stable distinction between inside and outside, motivating further militarization, metaphorical and literal, of their inner and outer borders. This anti-metaphoric goes both ways, as the immune system is figured as a military or policing function, while military and police draw on the functions of the immune system in formulating strategy. It is a question of self-policing, as Haraway notes. Quote, we seem invaded not just by the threatening non-selves that the immune system guards against, but more fundamentally by our own strange parts, end quote. Today, we can find several tendencies within this paradigm of bodily immune systems modeled as border controls and vice versa. One is the notion of the solid outer border separating self from other, domestic from foreign. This border is at once repressive and productive, of sovereign bodies and sovereign nations. Another is what I have called the desiring, productive, flexible, molecular immuno-security. This form, explored, for example, by Gilles Deleuze, sorry. Explored, for example, by Gilles Deleuze in the postscript on controlled societies, deals less with subjects or individuals than with individuals, sets of data captured and extracted from increasingly bare life and modeled through algorithmic systems. I previously noted that the first notion was at once, that of the solid outer border, was at once obsolete and reinvigorated, whereas the latter was already dated as hypermodern, belonging to a paradigm of extraction from unbounded flows. And recently, in an article titled COVID-19 and Rebordering the World, published in Radical Philosophy in the summer of this year, 2021, Claudia Arado and Martina Tassoli draw attention to how state responses globally to the COVID-19 pandemic has functioned on what they term a confinement continuum, comprising several registers or, quote, languages of lockdown, quarantine, or self-isolation, and the numerous measures taken at borders, vaccine nationalism, or the geopolitics of travel restrictions, end quote, as functions of re-emergent nationalist techniques of control or rebordering, with severe consequences for those undocumented or immigrating. In the context of this reading, we might understand this rebordering as a synthesis of the two tendencies in figuring immune systems as security systems. And though in contrast to this now familiar landscape, the post-pandemic world of infect your friends and loved ones is rather one of hinterlands and small-scale agriculture, though freedom of movement is curtailed by factionalist and opportunist violence. It is in this context not without irony that the trans women characters who were divided by pre-contagion, social hierarchies, and individual struggles to survive come to form in the face of imminent rather than slow death for these particular characters, bonds of mutual aid and T4T solidarity. Notably, the similarity of this survivalist scenario to other examples of US post-apocalyptic genre fiction in the past decades provides at once the opportunity to turn the genre towards envisionings, however self-aware, that oppose heteropatriarchal fantasies, while at the same time running the risk of repeating white supremacist and settler colonialist tropes of frontier autonomy in the attempt to depict the layering of and resistance to these regimes of power. One example of the complexity of resistance comes with the events wherein the narrator of the story, Transguard, becomes the patient zero, a trope that resonates with mythical but pervasive and deeply homophobic media narratives constructed around HIV/AIDS contagion in North America as being traceable to one single gay man. Having had a falling out with her friend Lexi some time prior, After periods of vulnerable intimacy and betrayal in the name of survival, the narrator gets injected with the vaccine in its contagious form by Lexi and Ralin, who had already injected themselves with a non-contagious variant. This is the hormone blocking vaccine. Her first thought is to self-isolate, but she decides to do so at her own home rather than at Lexi's. Walking home, she is assaulted by a group of men, and at the end defends herself. Quote, "An elated, vengeful sprite rises up from my lungs, ascends through the passage of my throat, and announces itself to the world as I cough right in his face." End quote. By allowing her interiority to become exterior, she also unfolds the precarious, violent conditions of her existence onto the whole social field, bringing about the end of the world. This folding and unfolding of subjective condition as social fact through contagion, mediated by multiple more than human others, can be analyzed as a fourfold complex, developing a transhuman animal bacterial figuration, or trans-animetaphoric, of what Paul Preciado would term the pharmacopornographic era, mirroring to an extent that of HIV/AIDS. In the first instance, there is the mythical origin ascribed to a human act or a human agency, a patient zero, already marked as deviant in terms of gender and sexuality. In the second fold, there are multiple sites of autoimmunity and intra-body self-other distinction, within the body as much as within the nation. These are, to speak with the metaphorics of war that Haraway emphasize, militarized zones, or more threateningly, zones of indistinction, potentially lawless zones. Third, a number of animal others involved with the mythical origin, such as pigs, boars, or deer in Infect Your Friends, or monkeys in discourses loaded with racist imaginaries surrounding HIV/AIDS. And finally, the microbiological fold, the level of the HIV virus or the carrier bacteria, strep pneumonia, and Infect Your Friends and Loved Ones. A mythical subject or agency, a non-identical fractured body or body politic, more than human animal scattering across the natural cultural field, a microbiology beyond the visible threshold, each of which might be weaponized, narrative. And it would be interesting to think how this analysis of the fourfold complex could be extended to coronavirus, but I'm not going to go into that here. Because the aim is not to develop an abstract frame to which various situations might fit. Instead, what is interesting is to think through each example, fictional or historical, in terms of its specificities corresponding to his historical process. Referencing the Collège de France lectures by Michel Foucault, Aradau and Tassioli summarize the relation between different historical productions of regimes of power and diseases as discussed throughout Foucault's works. Quote, leprosy, sovereign power; plague, disciplinary power; smallpox, biopower, and the security dispositives. End quote. They propose to read what they understand as the multiple reborderings of the world, a situation of various degrees of confinement imposed on the global scale, as such a novel regime of power. What might seem underdeveloped in their account is a notion of the subject or subjectivation, and perhaps this is by necessity in the midst of an historical unfolding. As a work of fiction, however, Infect Your Friends and Loved Ones might prove amenable to such a reading, as well as provide further insight into contemporary and speculative modes of subjectivation. In his book on Foucault, Deleuze, having followed Foucault's work from the epistemological to the ontological and the ethical, through histories of madness, the clinic, and sexuality, from the ancient Greeks to the Christian pastoral and modern disciplinary regimes, notes that the task at hand is to ask, quote, and what can we ultimately say about our own contemporary modes and our modern relation to oneself? What are our four folds? End quote. The reference to the four folds follows from a discussion on various historical diagrammatics of power, how power mobilizes, how it unfolds, quote, with a very flexible sedimentarity, end quote, how it maps out various distributions of features across a social plane, and in doing so, constitute that social plane. Where theories of proper nouns or repressive institutions such as states refer to molar categories, Deleuze is interested in following the molecular or microphysical relations that make up a given field, the recombinations and verb forms which become organized around the general or molar agency. Now we're coming towards the end. Understanding Foucault's reference to power knowledge as one of statements and visibilities, distributions of what can be said and what can be seen, which together make up a given historical phenomenon, such as a prison, as an outcome of a certain relation between forces. To allow for the flexibility of these arrangements throughout history, Deleuze turns to the notion of the diagram rather than structure. The diagram of biopower, for instance, designates a power that has life as its object and for which a form of life also appears or rather precedes it, as resistance. The key question, however, following in Deleuze's account, the approximate year of 1970, to which we might map not only the events following 1968, but also an event such as the oil crisis of 1973, as it marks the beginning of an end to the post-war capitalist growth phase, is the following, quote, what happens if the transversal relations of resistance continue to become stratified and to encounter or even construct knots of power, end quote. In other words, what happens when resistance turns on itself or turns itself inside out, constituting a new diagram of power? The question leads on the one hand, the notion of the outside or that which forces the relation between forces. And on the other hand, the subject as a mode of simultaneous freedom and restriction among a play of forces. Positing a single ontological plane, a plane of immanence, which is unfolded in on itself to constitute dualities and multiplicities, or unfolding out of itself to constitute multiplicity as infinity. Deleuze reads Foucault's last series of works, the volumes of the history of sexuality, as an elaboration of the relation to oneself, which is also a relation to the outside. Here is where the fourfold appears. Deleuze states, the general form, quote, the general formula of the relation to oneself is the affect of self by self, or folded force. Subjectivation is created by folding. Only there are four foldings, four folds of subjectivation, like the rivers of Inferno. And these are, first, material, body and pleasure for the ancient Greeks, flesh and desire for the Christians. And the second fold, power, relations between forces, and rule of law. And the third, knowledge, truth, relation of truth to being. And fourth, quote, the fold of the outside itself, which constitutes interiority from and as exteriority, connecting what is most subjective with what is perhaps infinite. This need not correspond neatly to the fourfold of any metaphorics of contagion proposed earlier in reading Infect Your Friends and Loved Ones. However, the overlaying of one on top of the other, as one diagram projected onto another, may reveal certain intersections, not least as Deleuze goes on to state that with each folding and with variation of how the diagram is actualized in different circumstances, quote, the relation to oneself is destined to encounter sexuality, according to a modality that corresponds to the mode of subjectivation. Sexuality appears, end quote, sexuality appears as the crux of not just a theory of the subject, but of a theory of subjectivation, and thereby of the constitution of the social and ontological field. Is there then another way of relating to sexuality, of constituting a self-other relation which does not fall back onto border policing? On the page following the comment from Lexi about T for T as an ideal, uttered among devastation and destitution of the world post-contagion, is a passage recounting a day the narrator spent at Trans Beach Pride in the years prior to the end of the world. The narrator encounters Lexi and a group of other trans girls who have been ignoring her for a long time, leaving her isolated. First, there is an account of an experience of restriction, living in stealth. Quote, allowing my closest friends to treat me like I'm just like them, which constrains me to act just like them, end quote. Then, as she is again briefly included among the group, quote, the sweetness of briefly unfolding my body for once in front of girls already unfolded tantalizes as much as the thought of refolding when I leave hurts." End quote. The different ways of living, as unfree and conditional as they are, offer potentially different modes of subjectivation, different foldings of bodies and desires. The utopian glimpse of trans speech pride, however, is realized as dystopia, where it is no longer a question of unfolding a sweetness, but only of unfolding pain from the interior of certain marginalized human and more than human subjectivations out onto the entire plane. It is the incomplete and destructive inversion of that system which anthropologist James C. Scott, in discussing the prevalence of epidemics among the earliest state formations, has called, quote, "a multi-species resettlement camp," end quote. At the end, the narrator, whose identity as an, quote, "antediluvian trans woman," end quote, is now barely legible and entirely demonized, barely recognizes T for T, whether as abbreviation, logograph, or as a unit of sound, becoming noise, T30, she says to me, quote. Having been freed from herself, the narrator, having passed through the degree zero of the patient zero, opens up to the siren drift of T for T. It does not enclose itself, but continues a process of folding and unfolding as T for T for T for T in a decentered potential trans-individuation. As such, Infect Your Friends and Loved Ones might provide us with a diagram in the negative for a possible world. In its terrible becoming tranimal, becoming with genetically modified pigs and bacterial contagion, leaving faces and landscapes scarred by toxins from impure industrial-grade hormonal substances. The violence which is unequally distributed across contemporary nature culture, relegated to certain folds, explodes and threatens to bring about, as a condition of possibility, an end to the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andria. Wonderful. Just have a quick question from the chat. Is this the detransition baby novel? Sorry, I missed the title.
Actually, it's not the detransition baby. It's an earlier novella by the same author, which is then called Infect Your Friends and Loved Ones. It's actually quite fun to see, since I first read this novella, how Tori Peters has become quite famous.
Thank you so much for that clarification. Cecilia, do you want to add something?
No, I think it's time for, if there's no other commentaries or quick questions of clarification, that we take a short break, a short body break for bodily things, and we return in 5 minutes, right, Lina?
Yes, because
5.
we need to
Yes,
have so much time as possible for discussions.
indeed. So bring back from the short 5-minute break your questions to Wibke and Andria. And once again, thank you so much, Wibke and Andria. Amazing talks.
Thank you.
So see you back in 1439. 5 minutes. Andria, can I just ask you, your brilliant presentation, is it published somewhere? Is there somewhere we could read it?
No, it's not published. I would love further feedback on it. So if people want to read it, I'd be very happy for them too. I am also thinking of where and how to publish it.
It should be published.
Yes. So welcome back. And the floor is open, friends, for questions, discussions, anything you can think of. Post questions in the chat or just speak out loud.
This is
Can I maybe respond to Ceci's?
Please, Wibke,
Go
ahead. Yeah.
I didn't know it was about me or it concerned me right now. Great. Okay, so that was a good comment. I just respond to it briefly now, and people can think a bit more if they have questions or not. So you said strategic anthropomorphism is a way of reading this narration or the speaking voice of the TARP. And I think that's an interesting way of considering it. I haven't until now, because there is something problematic about the anthropomorphization of things and non-human beings, because it always is like a living up to the human norm. It recenters the human, and it's normalized registers also, and also, speech as the normalized register. And so there is a really problematic aspect to it. But yes, strategic, of course, is a way of perceiving this, or like reading this as also really political, because that's a way of how pollution talks to us and talks back at us. And that's important. Is that how you read it in the sense of strategic?
Yeah, I would say so. I was thinking in terms of, the difficulty for us as, differently situated human beings to perceive of non-human agency. And one strategic approach that's been tried out is, of course, to fictionalize it, to give it some kind of strategic anthropomorphism. And I mean, scholars like Jane Bennett has written a little bit about that, and about Kafka's figure. I mean, Kafka uses a lot of these kind of strategic anthropomorphic, basically figurations. They act like figurations, and I don't necessarily think of, I don't know, what's it called, a thread in one of Kafka's books. There's a spool of thread. I don't know if that is the proper English term, but a spool of thread that is going through, telling us about life as a spool of thread, or red peat. I mean, it's not. I don't think it makes us think that this is a human subject necessary. So I think that there can be some value really to pointing out this, strategic, just as a way of showing agency. And some kind of, and there are of course many others like totemism. I mean, there are so many ways where we actually think about the non-human as having this kind of agency, and I think it does something important to us actually. So I haven't thought this really well, but but I think that is especially when it comes to waste and how to think about waste and what it does. I mean, it's not just these plastic garbage patches, in the oceans. I mean, we have waste everywhere on the planet, and everything has been waste, and we are returning to waste. And so, I mean, we could think about waste ontologies as having always been what we're made of, if you wish. I mean, from what we breathe out. So, and what plants produce, etc. So this was just. Thank you so much, Wibke, for.
Sounds great. Thank you so much.
With me here on this.
Super nice.
I believe Lina. Sorry, Lina. Now I'm interrupting you again. But we have a question, Lina, right?
We have. Should I read it out loud? Maybe it's easier. So this is a question for Wibke. I'm interested in hearing more about how do you see your work from a decolonial perspective? Radicalized bodies who are already ontologized plastic, and how do their bodies be seen in this notion of toxic trans bodies? Does it cost further denial?
That's a very complex question. A lot of things are in there to unpack. Not so sure if I grasp everything, but let's see. further denial of the vulnerability of the racialized other, I'm wondering here, or the denial of the vulnerability of the marginalized other. I don't think, well, I think a decolonial perspective could be really important to consider for this. As I said earlier, there is so much relationality between the trans other and the racialized other, in especially the context of Scandinavia, where whiteness is so dominant and is also only so recently challenged. I mean, if you think about non-white bodies entering the Scandinavian context, that has only happened 50 years ago, basically. This is unimaginable from an American or Canadian perspective, for instance, or even from a sort of French or English perspective is also different. But like in Scandinavia, and also since I'm German and I'm having that background, there's a lot of relationship in terms of how the white body has been validated and romanticized, and yeah, so much more than just romanticized. I don't have words for that, but there is a purity that is over-idealized, that is really problematic, and that has so much relationship with how the trans body is also written out of this purity. So I don't think I'm actually now addressing your question, because I think it's a bit complex, and there's maybe not the space to really properly untangle it, but maybe I answered part of it. Thank you for the question anyway.
Thank you so much. And I apologize that we have so little time. So we're moving on. The next
it's totally our fault. Andrea and we were just speaking too long. We should have really.
We need to do this again, people. We need to do this again.
Yes.
With continuations.
So we have a comment to Sissy's question. Do you want to address that, Sissy?
I think it's from Ted, right? We camp in a lot of Zoom rooms, me and Ted. So just go ahead, Ted, and ask Wibke, maybe.
Oh,
he's in a library. No, but they are in a library. So sorry. No. Maybe Ted is thinking about that if we fear to always anthropomorphize things, which kind of feels like it ultimately ends up reproducing liberalism. I think there's a lot to gather from Mel Chen and Dana Luciano's notion of queer or trans in humanism. Maybe
yeah, I think briefly I can pick up on that, Ted. Thanks for the comment. This special issue published by Mel Chen and Dana Luciano is really wonderful. I think it's a special issue in GLQ on trans in humanism. Is it actually called like that? It's a lot on object ontologies, and yeah, it's really great. And your comment is interesting to consider in this context of strategic anthropomorphism, considering it as like an inhumanism, like the grammar of inhumanism. Yeah, lovely comment. Thank you.
Do we have any further questions for Andria? Such a rich paper with lots of things to unpack. If not, I have a little bit of a weird, maybe provocative question to both of you, and you can just run with it. I'm thinking about when the life sciences was super popular, and the mapping of the human genome project was at its peak at the millennial turn, and a lot of genes were being mapped out and localized on the chromosomes. And at that point, there was a research team, I think it was led by someone called Dean Hamer, who proposed to have found the gay gene. I don't remember what it's called, but this was in the kind of reaction in the gay communities was really, to me, somewhat strange, because in the gay community, a lot of people were really embracing this and say, "Thank you, I'm not unnatural. This is part of my genetics." And thanking, the team, and they had the T-shirt saying, "Thank you, Mom, for the insert name of gene." And I mean, a lot of kind of celebration around founding. Then, of course, this research was actually retracted, I believe, and there's no such thing as a gay gene. But can you see where I'm taking this? I want to see a parallel to the discourse now, the scientific discourse on endocrine disruptors, for instance. Would there be any possibility for a welcoming response? And I'm actually thinking of a film that is kind of welcoming, not necessarily endocrine disruptors per se, but all kinds of toxins. And it's called Apple Grown in Wind Tunnel. It's an artistic film. Let's not go into that. But do you think that could that be a possible response to scientific insights about pesticides, all these kind of toxins that we are living and breathing in new ways? So that's my provocation.
Andrea, you want to say something on that?
Well, I think my speculation, perhaps my thought would be that there has maybe been a kind of shift since the turn of the millennium, early 2000s, from a kind of liberal humanist way of also conceiving politics in terms of celebrating identities, which can then be sort of anchored in like a positivist idea of biology, to one which is perhaps a lot more inhuman or disposing of the human, as you can see, the development of capitalism, which for which more and more humans become disposable, and so I think that would be a shift, in how endocrine disruptors are perceived politically.
Sissy, you mentioned a film.
Oh, it's an art film called Apple Grown in Wind Tunnel. I will write it down. It was a film that was actually screened at KTH with the Environmental Humanities Lab some years ago. I will have to look at the poster to see who did it. But the title is Apple Grown in Wind Tunnel. And it's a weird, wonderful film where the dystopian is kind of twisted into some kind of utopian. Well, it's actually available, I think, on the internet. Apple Grown in Wind Tunnel, and I cannot for my life see from here who did it. No, I'm sorry, I can't. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm always looking for more art that addresses this topic, so that's why I'm specifically interested in it. So if any one of you here has ideas, you can write the names in the chat, and it doesn't matter if they're Nordic-based artists or not. Generally just interested in knowing what's out there and how endocrine disruptors are discussed in art or pollutants.
We have a question in the chat for everyone. Isn't the environmental pollution a possible safe explanation of being trans? Safe, like it's a tangible reason.
I mean, do we need an explanation for being heterosexual? Like, why is somebody heterosexual? It's because environmental pollution has made that happen. And like, so I'm just saying this in a provocative way, because like, why do we need a tangible reason.
Yeah, and my question is also a little bit provocative. It was my intention, because what Cecilia was saying about this possible gene being responsible for being gay, and this is something even for gay people, like maybe helping them to explain, but why do we need this explanation? We should feel that this is totally proper and normal without this thinking like, okay, so right now we can say, that's why I'm asking, if we have this topic of pollution, which is actually produced by humanity, then we can say, okay, we have this, I don't know, this, let's say, aberration, because we are doing certain things. But of course, I agree that this is not something which should be necessary for any point.
We have a raised hand, so I'm sorry that I'm just hurrying on, but Jürgen, would you like to ask something?
Yes, I was just thinking of a follow-up from Carolina's question there, or comment actually, to Wibke. But first, thank you so much both for amazing presentations. But when you started your presentation with this Facebook post, Wibke, I was thinking that it was just some crazy troll. But then I was quite surprised to see the amount of studies about the connection between EDCs and gender dysphoria. And I was thinking, you know, what against cuts are these studies performing, and what apparatuses are used, and what epistemological and ontological assumptions are being made. And I was wondering if you could tell us something about, you know, what rationales are used to defend this position that there is a connection between EDCs and trans bodies to explore, actually.
Yeah, I don't know the rationale. Thank you so much for this comment or question, but I don't know it yet. I don't understand it yet myself. So this is why I'm like jumping into this topic to explore this further and to like grasp it, because it's incomprehensible to me at this point. So this is really just the beginning of my thoughts on this. But yeah, this is why I cannot give you an answer to this question. But that's exactly what I'm wondering about. Yeah.
Great stuff. Thank you.
Yeah. We look forward to the next seminar. We present the work. Okay.
I think we definitely have to continue on this track. So, I mean, once again, a warm thank to you, Andria, for an amazing paper that I hope we can give you tips on how to get that published somehow. And Wibke, amazing. Thank you so much. You've been a long-standing person within the Posthumanities Hub. So thank you again so much. And Lina, you're an amazing chair.
You too, and you all have been an amazing audience. And thank you so much, the presentators of today. I mean, I'm so mind blown by your presentation. I wonder if we should say something about what's up at the hub, Cici.
Well, what's up at the hub is something that is really happening very soon, namely tomorrow. So tomorrow we have an amazing new seminar, and it's actually run by the mushrooming little group called Humus Economicus, and it's a seminar called Soil Blindness and the Value of Dirt, a seminar on ecological economics, soil care and homemaking in times of transition. So already tomorrow we have this seminar, and so it's at 10:15. So for all of you in this time zone, 10:15 to 12 tomorrow. And please register to get a Zoom link for this session. Now, thank you all so much for attending, and let's keep these conversations going. And Janna Holmstedt, who is actually organizing it, is telling us all in the chat, you can still register for it. So please go ahead and just register for the soil economy seminar that we have tomorrow. Thank you all so much for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye for now.
Bye.
Hello.